Welcome, everyone. This is Brian Eiler coming to you from the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. For another installment of our Mekong Water Data Hour. Today, we are joined by Dr. Ian Baird, who is a professor of geography at University of Wisconsin and by far the most published person on Mekong issues, coming to us with another interesting set of findings. And we're going to be joined by other discussants today to discuss Ian Baird's findings. We're going to hear from Dr. Kanakwan Manaram, who is associate professor and at the Department of Social Science at Ubon Ratchathani University in Thailand. And sitting in for Dr. Surachai Wongao will be my colleague Courtney Weatherby, from the Stimson Center, Deputy Director of our Southeast Asia program and Mekong expert. And they're going to engage Dr. Baird on his findings. And after that, we're going to hear from all of you with some questions, because I think you will be intrigued by what we're going to learn today. Just before we start, it was a pleasure of ours at the Stimson Center to be able to provide a small grant to Dr. Baird and his team to conduct the studies that you're going to learn about today. He visited a number of communities along the Thai-Lao border, all the way then down to Cambodia during this dry season to learn about what the impacts of hydrological change during the dry season is along that course of the river, along that segment of the river. And that grant was supported by the Chino Siniega Foundation, a small family foundation out of Palm Springs, California, that has supported our work, our Mekong work at the Stimson Center for nearly 2 decades. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Baird. Thanks for joining us from Thailand at the end of your sabbatical. Over to you, Ian.
Okay, so I'll just share my screen here. Just a second. Okay. There we go. Okay, so can everyone hear me okay? Hopefully you can all hear me, okay? Yeah? Okay, good. Okay, well, yeah, firstly, I'd like to thank the Stimson Center for supporting the research that I'll be talking about today. It was great to be able to do this and have the funding to be able to do it properly, so thank you very much for that. And for the foundation that supported Stimson to support me. So yes, thank you very much. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about, as Brian mentioned, some research that I've done this last dry season during the month of March and early April, together with some colleagues, looking at changes in the Mekong River and specifically during the dry season. And during this research, we visited a total of 44 villages along the Mekong. 32 of those are in 8 provinces in northern and northeastern Thailand. And then we visited another 9 villages in southern Laos, and then 3 villages in northeastern Cambodia, north of Stung Treng. So these are all the villages marked on this map, are the ones that we visited. And this is our team in Chiang Rai province when we visited the villages there, working with living rivers there. And then this is us traveling out in a boat to visit some villagers out there. And then in each place we went, we basically organized a kind of discussion with local people who have a perspective over, the last 30 years that are able to talk about the changes that have occurred during that period. So most of our meetings were sort of along the edge of the Mekong, with between a few people and sometimes up to 10 or more people, depending on the location. And so this is really information that we've gathered from them about their perspective on the changes that have occurred. This is us in northeastern Thailand, working with the team there. And this is us traveling down in northern Thailand in various ways. This is Reagan, who's also with Stimson, traveling with us for a few villages there in Lui province. So, okay. Firstly, I'll just talk about the main sort of take-home messages, because I'm not going to be able to go through all the things that people have told us over this trip. There'll be more that we'll be writing about this over the future. So today is really just a snapshot or a brief summary of the main findings, but there's certainly lots more to come in relation to this research. But basically, the overall message that we received from villagers is that the Mekong has changed dramatically over the last few decades. And the main things that people point to in terms of, the broader types of impacts that they've noticed are daily water fluctuations due to water releases from dams upstream. Obviously, seeing that especially in the northern part of Thailand, closer to the Chinese dams, but even all the way down to southern Laos and even northeastern Cambodia, those daily fluctuations are all also evident, although not as severe as farther north. The other thing that was widely reported is a sort of change in the color and turbidity in the Mekong River, from being a kind of whitish or brownish sort of river to being green or green-black, the way that people now describe it. So that's another major change that people have reported. And then the third major thing are sort of changes in water levels during the dry season. And that's what and actually it's sort of the last two things that I'll be focusing on in today's presentation. So, we were interested. We talked to some government officials also who work on collecting data on water changes. So there's a lot of gauges along the river, and we talked to them, and we talked to even villagers who are involved in this data collection. So that also, added to what local people had said. So we're interested in both what local people to say, but also whatever data is available that helps us, to understand what's happening. So we're trying to use all the different tools available to understand. So one of the big questions that emerged, and we were a bit surprised by the results of this, was we were asking people if there's more or less water in the Mekong River during the dry season compared to a few decades ago. And we expected that all the villages would say there's more water. And the reason why they would say that is because we know well from the hydrological data that there is more water in the Mekong during the dry season, generally speaking, over the last few decades. And that this is due to dams upstream, both especially in China and to some degree in Laos, holding back water especially the larger dams with big reservoirs, holding back water during the rainy season, and then releasing it some of it during the dry season. And that's the reason why there's more water. But what we were surprised to hear was, and we'd done some research on this in Stung Treng province in Cambodia a couple of years ago, and villagers had widely reported that there was more water in the Mekong, and so we expected that upstream they would be saying the same things. And the results were not what we expected. So in the top villages up in Chiang Rai, it was what we expected. All the villages there reported that there's much more water in the Mekong than there used to be. And then when we got down to Lue province, where we visited some villages there, they were also saying the same thing as they were in Chiang Rai, that there's more water in the dry season than there used to be. But then when we got to Nong Khai province, we were surprised to hear from villagers that they believed that there was less water in the Mekong during the dry season than there used to be. And that wasn't just one village. There was probably more than, I haven't done all the calculations yet, but it looks like about 20 or more villages were saying that, all the way from Nong Khai down to Amnat Jalurn, basically all this area here, everyone's saying that there is less water in the Mekong. So this previously, I'd seen posts on social media, people saying, oh, if there's more water, more dams built on the Mekong River, there'll be less water in the Mekong during the dry season. And this, doesn't fit with the data from the hydrological stations. And yet that is what people were reporting, and not just in one village, but many, many, many villages. So, and then when we get down to Ubon, then it changes again. And villagers start telling us that there's more water in the Mekong than there used to be. And that continues on all the way down into southern Laos, where they're also reporting that. And then, of course, into northeastern Cambodia as well. They're reporting more water. So what does it mean when you have the upper villages saying there's more water, the middle villagers saying there's less water, and then the downstream villages saying there's more water. I mean, this, how can the water disappear and then come back again? I mean, this, and if it was just, one village or two villages saying this, we might attribute that to maybe some misunderstanding or some, but this is like 20 villages or so. And these are people that have spent a lot of time, all their lives on the river, and, have a very detailed understanding of it. And so we couldn't easily just dismiss these reports, but we didn't understand what's going on. Why would this be the case? Why would people be reporting this? And I think this really highlights the importance of talking to local people to understand their perspectives about things, because sometimes the data doesn't explain all the things that local people understand. And so we need to have this sort of local perspective to understand. And this raised this question, okay, why are people thinking this? And so that was an sort of unexpected but important focus of our research. It's turned into that. So after we finished the field work in early April, we managed to get some data from the Thai government regarding turbidity, because turbidity was one of the important things. And so we wanted to figure out if this might be part of the explanation. And you can see here, this is data we got data for like the early, this is in Ching San, and this is the blue is the early 1990s, 1990, 91, 92 is the amount of turbidity. And then the orange is in the early 2000s, 2020, 21, 22. So a combination of 3 years of data in both cases and comparing the two. You can see very clearly that the turbidity is, the amount of silt that's coming down the river has declined dramatically. And I mean, we haven't done the exact calculations yet, but it's more than 90% gone, and then if you go farther down to Nong Khai, this is the way it looks. A little bit more silt there for whatever reason than there is in Ching San, but still quite a reduction compared to what there was. And then if we go further down to Kong Chiam, we see also dramatic declines compared to what there used to be. And of course, this explains what people are talking about when they talk about the river changing color, right? And it's obviously been a dramatic decline in turbidity. And this is a really important part of the explanation for why local people are understanding things the way they do. And I'll explain more about that now. So if you think about the dams in China and the tributaries of Laos in particular, where there's been a lot of dams built over the last number of years, these dams are all kind of holding back sediment, right? They're holding back the sediment that previously went down the river. And I mean, some of that sediment is getting through, but a smaller amount and also smaller size sediment. So the more, the large grains of sand and things that used to come down are much less common than they used to be, which is not surprising because they tend to drop out more behind the dams. So that's the first thing to understand. The second thing to understand is there's another element, which is sand mining. And sand mining is also removing a significant amount of silt from the river. We've learned since then that there's not any clear data either in Laos or in Thailand in terms of exactly how much is being removed. But we did find out recently that there's about 141 sand mining concessions on the Mekong in Thailand alone. That's not including the ones in Laos, which is maybe a similar number or maybe a bit less. It's not entirely clear. We're still working on that data. But that sand mining is another question. And one of the big questions that a lot of people have been asking in the Mekong is this decline in sediment. How much is it attributable to the dams? How much is it attributable to sand mining? And that's one of the things that we've become rather interested in. So coming back to the original issue of why local people in the upper level think there's more water, the people in the middle think there's less, and the people down below think there's more. Let's take a look at a picture of the river in Chiang Rai. So in Chiang Rai, you can see here, there's a lot of rock, bedrock, that's sort of at the bottom of the river. The river morphology is characterized by a lot of rock. And that's important because it's not sand at the bottom of the river, it's rock at the bottom of the river with a smaller amount of sand or no sand at all. And that is important. Then if you go further down, let's say like Nakhon Phanom, which is a picture here, you can see that there is much less rock, very, very little rock. And in fact, it's mostly sand. The bottom of the river is mainly sand. And just to give you an idea, I visited a guy who's involved in the sand mining business north of Vientiane in Laos. And he told me that in the early 1990s, in front of his sand mining operation, every year at the end of the rainy season, there used to be 6 meters deep of sand. Then once the Chinese dams began to be built in the 1990s, early 2000s, it went to 3 meters at the end of the rainy. Now it's at 80 centimeters. So it's gone from 6 meters to 80 centimeters over 30 years that he's been involved in that business. And so this is part of the explanation. So in that part of the river, there's a lot of sand. And most of the sand mining operations are also in the area where there's a lot of sand, not surprisingly, not in the rocky areas. Then if you go down further to Ubon Ratchathani province, here's the riverbed again. And you can see here again, a lot of rock, right? A lot of rock and much less sand. There are some parts of the river where there's a bit more sand, but for the most part, it's largely rock. And there's also less sand mining there as well. So what we believe is happening here is that if let's say you had 1 meter more of water during the dry season than you previously had, and so in Chiang Rai and in Lurie province, they see there's 1 more meter of water, and that's added on to what there previously was, and the water level looks higher, and people recognize that there's more water. But when you get down to the middle level, and there's a lot less sediment, and the sediment levels are declining, and the riverbed was previously largely sediment, not bedrock, it's actually the riverbed is gone down. So let's say you have an average of 2 meters of sand disappearing, because in the case that I mentioned, it's over 5 meters, but in other cases it's maybe a meter or less. It depends on it's not the same across all the river. So if it's gone down, let's say this is just, we don't know, we haven't done the research to know exactly how far it's gone down, but let's say it's gone down 2 meters, but there's 1 meter more of water, then if people are looking at the riverbank and they're looking at certain places that they've noticed the water go up to in the past, they would see that it's lower than it used to be, because 1 more meter of water, but 2 meters lower in the riverbed, that's going to make it look like there's actually less water in the river. So we think this is a result of reduction of sediment, okay? And judging from the interviews I've had, the big declines in sediment did not happen gradually over time, which might be expected due to sand mining, but it coincided with the construction of large dams along the river. First the Chinese dams, later the Sayabuli Dam or other tributary dams. So we think that the dams are the main reason for this, and the reduction of sediment is causing, and talking to other people who's done some work on this in Cambodia and Vietnam, they're also noticing the same sort of thing. But this hasn't previously been reported, in this part of the river. It's mostly been looked at farther downriver. So this is a kind of interesting finding that we wouldn't have noticed or known about if it hadn't been for what local people had explained. And so what it turns out is that local people are not wrong, right? They just from what their observations are correct, but they're probably not understanding that the riverbed has gotten deeper and there's less sediment there, causing the water to look like it's less than it used to be. So that's what we think has happened. We don't think we also looked at water withdrawal. Could that be an issue? And it could be in the future, but water just doesn't leave and then the water go down and then come back again, So water removal doesn't explain it, but it's really the sediment issue that explains what's going on. So what are the implications of this? Well, there are seasonally flooded forests along various parts of the river, and when there's more water in the river, this can cause problems. Now, in the middle part of the river, there's not that much of seasonally flooded forest anyway, because it's mostly sandy. So there's not as much there, and the water has not is not the level of the water in the river is not being higher than it used to be because of the issue I just mentioned. So the impacts there of the dying of flooded forests is not so high. But in the upper part, like in Chiang Rai and in Luri province, this is an issue, and it's causing the loss of flooded forest species that have been because these species are specially adapted. They can survive in the river underwater for 6 or more months of the year, but they need a certain period in the dry season to be out of the water in order to survive. And if they're still underwater for that during the dry season for a longer period, then it disrupts their life cycle and they sort of die. So this is the change in hydrology is sort of affecting the flora that has relied on these fluctuations over time. And these are very important species for the life cycles of lots of fish species and shellfish and other aquatic animals, that rely on it. So, for example, this is one species. Now, this species is specially adapted. Most trees and bushes in Southeast Asia, in the monsoon season, will grow mainly during the wet season when there's lots of water, and in the dry season, they tend to not grow as much because there's not as much water. So their main growth season is in the rainy season. But these species are the exact opposite. Their growth is mainly during the dry season because that's when the water goes down and they come out of the water and their leaves come out and they're the most vibrant during that time. And then in the rainy season, when they get flooded, they lose their leaves and they basically sort of hibernate over the wet season. And so they're specially adapted to river conditions. And even though they're maybe in small numbers, they're very important for habitat for a lot of species. We might call them keystone species of the river because they have a larger importance than their quantities would suggest. And here's 2 different species that are found in the river, and you can see them in the middle here of the river. And they latch onto rocks. They're mainly found in rocky areas. These ones are in far southern Laos where there's been less change, and they're doing okay. These are some of the larger species, what they call Goklam Sang in Laos, and this is in Ubon Ratchathani province, and they are larger species that are found only in the sort of southern part of some of the southern part of northeastern Thailand, and then into Laos, and especially in northeastern Cambodia. And here's another picture of some of them, and you can see they're dying. These ones are dying because they've been underwater too long. And this is another example of some of them that have been underwater too long and they've died as a result. And this picture is probably the most interesting. This is actually taken by a Thai person who lives in Kamarat in Ubon Ratchathani, and this is a picture taken in March. The upper one is taken in March, I guess nine years ago, and then the one below is taken in the same month, 4 years ago. And you can see that it was vibrant and living 9 years ago, but 4 years ago, they've all died, because of, it depends where they're located. If they're higher up along the river, then they tend to survive better. The ones that are lower down have tended to be flooded more because the water level is higher. So this is one of the big impacts of these changes, and that's affecting the ecosystem and, of course, the livelihoods of people who are dependent on all the different aquatic animals and fish and things that rely on these flood forests. Now, this is just below the Con Falls. If you look across the river here, this is northeastern Cambodia, but the picture was taken from the Laos side of the border. And actually, this is in a village where I used to live in the 1990s. And when I lived there, every year, I lived there for 7 years between 1993 and 1999. At that time, during the dry season, this is taken in early April, the lowest water season of the year. It was all rock in this picture. You could hardly see any water at all. It was almost all rock, and there was just a couple of very small channels that people could get their boats into the dock of this to the riverbank next to this village. But now you could take your boat in almost anywhere. There's it's all water, and this is just an indicator of how much more water there is now in the dry season. Although this year and last year there's been less water in the dry season than there was 3 or 4 years ago, but there is still more now than there used to be, and people have no doubt about that. And this is partially because just below the Con Falls, the river is much narrower than above the river, so it kind of funnels in there, and that's one of the reasons why it's more noticeable here than, let's say, above the Con Falls, where it's much wider and the water gets distributed more. And so this is just below. This is in Stung Treng, and you can see the dead flooded forest trees at the edge of the river there, where they've died some years ago. And you can see here that other ones dead on the edge of the river, but ones farther back that are a little bit higher up are still surviving. So they're not all dead, but some of them are dead. And, you know, villagers report about 50%. And some species that are farther down in the riverbed have been more seriously impacted, like up to 90% or more. Whereas ones that are, some that are higher up have been, you know, impacted, you know, much less. So it depends on the species of bush or tree, but there's been some significant impacts. This is sandbars, and you might say, well, what does this have to do? Well, firstly, there's less sediment, but the other problem with sandbars is that they often, you know, develop behind flooded forest. You can see in this case at the head of the sandbar, there's some flooded forest there, and that allows the sand to sort of accumulate because the flow is disrupted by the trees, and that allows the sand to accumulate. And those sandbars are important habitat for a lot of different species, whether they be shellfish or you know, certain insects. I mean, we talk to people about a lot of different species. I won't get into all the details, but there's a lot of different species that are affected by this. And in many cases, you know, up to 50% of the sandbars have disappeared, partially because of reduction of sediment, but also partially because of reduction of flooded forest to allow for these sandbars to develop. And it's also important habitat for certain birds. This is a river tern that, you know, makes its nest in the sandbar. So there's a reduced habitat for certain, you know, especially some endangered, threatened species that rely on this important habitat are now being threatened because of the reduction of sediment and sandbars. So sandbars may not seem that important to people, but they actually are quite important to the river ecosystem. This is a small pratincoal, which is another species that makes its nests on sandbars, right? So there's a number of different species. I won't go into all the details, but there's a number of species that are being affected by this change. Now, this is a riverbank embankment that now has become very prevalent along the Mekong, especially on the Thai side. So a lot of people might be surprised to know that this sort of embankment now encompasses 83% of the Mekong River along the Thai border has now been embanked. On the Laos side, it's much less. It's about 12%, 12 to 13%. So these are statistics coming from the Lao government that they gave me. So in many ways, why are they building all these embankments? Well, it has a lot to do with the erosion that I talked about earlier along the riverbed. So as there's less sediment coming down, the water is clearer. And then what happens is what we call the hungry water effect, which basically is that when water has less sediment in it, it will pick up more sediment. It has a greater ability to erode. And there's been a lot of erosion that occurred after the dams were built, in China in particular. And then that caused a lot of erosion downstream along Thailand. And there was a lot of land that was lost at that time. And this sparked the government to start thinking seriously about embanking the river. So in many ways, the embankments, which in themselves cause a certain impact to all the vegetation along the river, is really a result of the dams, right? This is an attempt to mitigate the impacts of erosion along the riverbanks. And erosion is not just occurring along the riverbanks, as I mentioned, it's also occurring along the floor of the river as well. But the riverbank erosion has resulted in a huge amount of investment and you know, associated impacts. But local people, they feel like it's necessary because they were losing a lot of their land prior to these embankments being put up. So this is a big change in the river that needs more investigation, and it hasn't been seen as a mitigation measure for the impacts of dams, but that's what it really is. And this is one of the problems that's occurring. Okay, so I'm going to conclude to give us lots of time for questions and discussion. basically, you can say here, and like I said, there's lots more I could talk about this, but I don't want to, go too long, and I want to give chance for more discussion. There's turbidity levels in the Mekong River have declined dramatically. This comes from local people's reports, but also from data that we've received from the Thai government. And it's primarily due to the dams holding back sediment, right? Sand mining is also a contributing factor, but there's not much data available, which is a bit of a problem. None of the countries in the Mekong are sending sand mining data to the MRC, for example. The MRC has no data on this because the countries are not providing it. And it's likely to be causing, accumulated with the dam impacts is increasing it. But we do believe that the dams are the main cause of sediment decline, not sand mining per se. So in many ways, the impacts on sand mining, which has also occurred, is also an impact of the dams. This business that people have been doing along the river is now being negatively impacted by reduction of sediment coming down the river. And this erosion that's occurred along the river bank, especially between Nong Khai and Amnat Jalun, where the river is quite sandy, has resulted in the riverbed becoming deeper. And this has led to the appearance that there is less water in the river in the dry season, even though there's actually more water, we know from the hydrological stations. So this is why, it's great to have, all the different satellite data and hydrological data and turbidity data. This is all important, but we really need to understand what local people are thinking as well, and understanding and what their observations are, because they're the ones who are being impacted the most. And this also explains, why is it that they're thinking, many of them thinking, oh, more dams built, that'll mean that we'll have less water in the dry season. I mean, that's not the case, but many of them believe that because that's what they've observed, right? And so this is an important finding, and it also leads us to understand that there are major changes happening in the river in terms of the riverbed, the river morphology, due to this erosion that's occurring. Now, more research needs to be done on this. There has been not much research done in this part of the river. There's been much more research on sediment issues in Cambodia and especially Vietnam, but in this part of the river, very little. And so more needs to be done to understand the fundamental ways in which the river is changing. And really, if it wasn't for the reports that we receive from local people, we wouldn't know to look at this issue in the way that we're looking at it now. So my belief is we need to take all the different tools available, whether it be local people's reports, whether it be reports coming from managers of sand mining operations, or coming from data that we've received from the governments, or, these are all important observations, and combining them together can help us to better understand the type of changes that are occurring in the river. And so, thank you so much for your time. And I'm looking forward to having more discussion about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. And much of this started with a Facebook post. I forget if it was from Kanakwan or from Ombun, both whom are active there in that part of Thailand, noting how the river levels were lower during the dry season. And the two of us engaged in that Facebook post saying, hey, wait, what's happening? We know that there's more water. And just really grateful that you were able to go and follow up on that question and not let it go as just some type of anomaly, to demonstrate that indeed it is happening. In addition to the suggestions and solutions that for further investigation that you've listed out, I think that another part of the problem is that the gauges that provide publicly available data are too far spread apart. If there were more kind of acute gauges along the course of the river, particularly in this area where they're saying the dry season levels are lower, then that would also show up in the data and lead to more investigation. So again, excellent work, much more work to be done. We're going to hear now from Dr. Kanakwan Manaram and Courtney Weatherby with some reactions, and have a quick discussion here. Kanakwan, I know you've been watching this part of the river for a long time. You live very close to it and work with communities. What do you think about Ian's findings?
Okay, thank you very much, Brian, and also Stimson, for inviting me to be part of this interesting session. I think I have a few thoughts to discuss with Ian and Ian's writing. Number one, I highly appreciate what Ian had done. But I think particularly Ian covered 44 villages. I thought, wow, it's just a lot of villages from Chiang Mai to Sing Trang and cover 2 countries. I call it from ethnographic study, they call multi-sited studies. You try to address people's perspective, knowledges with regarding to the changes in the river system, particularly the Mekong mainstreams, and from the local knowledge and experiences, which I think it's not many people mentions about that. As you said, I think it's quite new insight and also new findings. It's very greatly contributing to the knowledge on the Mekong river systems and how we're going to use this for the policy recommendations on how we're going to develop or manage the Mekong in a better way to save the life of the people, to save the ecological systems being destroyed by hydropower and sand minings and other threats like riverbank and embankment. I think this is the first one. So it's kind of multi-sited study providing intensive and insightful findings or from the local perspective, local experiences, and local values given to the river. This is my first response. The second one, I think, as Brian said, I have been doing some research on the livelihood of the people living along the Mekong and also around the tributary of the Mekong, like the Mekong River Basin. And I just come back from the field work on the Mekong River Basins on the wetland areas, around the wetland areas. I found that the livelihood of the people depending on the river is really important. Nowadays, the economy in Thailand, even in Laos and also in Cambodia is not great. So the river become the important sites of local people who return from big city to come back and to live their life. And they use a lot more river resources to sustain their life. So loss of river resources caused by hydropower, caused by irrigation project, or caused by sand mining is very, very severe problem felt by local people. So it's really big threat to local livelihood and particularly on food security, income security. I found that over the past, 15 years, even almost 30 years, particularly on the tributary of the Mekong, like the Mekong River Basin, and particularly fishing livelihood, the riverbank garden mentioned by Ian, and also ecological services provided by ecological systems. So the death of the trees and also the death of many plants along the river because of no or without or less sediments. Since the dams a lot more dam to come, and also the existing dam that been already built and block the sedimentation to flow upstream to downstreams. I did the research with Carl Medington. I mentioned his names on the sedimentation and the clear water, on 2 years ago. So we thought that people just so alert and then you're so surprised and then so upset about why the Mekong so clear. So the riverbank garden used to be planted, but now they couldn't be able to do it as ever because clear water doesn't provide any nutrient for local people to grow plants, to grow like cotton, even watermelon or other leafy vegetables. So which very good and which very important for local income and local food. So this is the second point about livelihood that been affected by the change in the river system and perceived and felt by local people. Of course, the knowledge on the changing water level of the water from different places, from other places, they know that this is the dam, but maybe they don't know, but some people, they know so well because of the dam caused the change of the hydrological systems. Maybe some people, they don't know what caused the water change. It's okay, but some people who've been involved with civil society organization on dam campaigning. They know what's happening and what's going on. So my other point is that, I think it's time for the scientific knowledge and local knowledge to be integrated. We can't rely on local knowledge alone. So we need to have scientific knowledge. I appreciate that Ian went to the government organization to ask the information from the Department of, I don't know, maybe irrigation, I don't know, the government organization. But for us as academic, and also we need to work more with local people and integrate local or indigenous knowledge or local knowledge with scientific knowledge in order to, to address environmental problems. And the role of academics should be, more intensive in order to address the problem, and also how we're going to deal with that, how we use the problem, use the knowledge on the ground, intensive field work like Ian did, in order to inform, in order to provide a space or platform for dialogue more and more with other stakeholders, particularly private sector who have been doing the sand mining, or the private sector who are developing the hydropower plants, even alternative energies like green and I don't know solar energies or other kind of energy. So we need all the actors to work together and use this knowledge. We have to have one set of knowledge and do it more simple for local people to understand what's going on. And also the language Ian used in the report, I think I like it because, it's quite simple and straightforward from local perspective, which mainly the scientific people like to use the big terms, which is very difficult to understand. But this one, I think, Simpson's and Ian's work, I think address really insightful with very understandable language and accessible language. It would be nice if Ian translated into Lao and Thai languages in order to make people, even Cambodian, because you also went to Cambodia, even Cambodian people can understand, and local people, indigenous people understand what's Ian doing, and they could be able to use this kind of evidence based to work further or to negotiate, to inform, or to coordinate, I don't know, whatsoever term we would like to use in order to improve the life of the people, and also to provide room for people to participate in decision making around hydropower and sand mining, even the riverbank embankment. This is my response. Yeah.
Thank you, Ajahn Kanakwan. We're going to hear really quickly some comments and questions from Courtney, and then back to you, Ian, for some responses.
Indeed. Well, I know I'll try to keep this somewhat brief because I want to make sure we do get time for the Q&A with the audience. But Ian, I just want to say thank you again for doing this research. I think I'm coming from a similar perspective, but slightly different perspective from Ajahn Kanakwan, because our team at the Stimson Center does a lot with the data. And we do a lot with the data at the system scale through our Mekong Dam Monitor, where we measure, the impacts of 55 of the largest dams across the river basin on the river system. And that is rooted in, on the ground gauges. It's rooted in data from Mekong River Commission. It's rooted in satellite imagery and remote sensing. And it provides a very useful insight. But what it is not deeply rooted in, although it is responsive to, are those local perspectives that Ian has been gathering on the ground, and that Ajahn Kanakwan was just talking about as a key and vital complement to that data, because data is really only useful if it can be used by people and if it is trusted by people. And the sort of the question that sparked this study that Brian and Ian mentioned about, apparent discrepancies in river levels and perceptions between different villages along the river is an important thing to address, because when we're looking at this sort of broader data and we're simply tracking the river flow, we're not going to necessarily see that river level, the riverbed level has dropped. That's not something that we can track with satellite data very easily. And so this type of ground truthing and you're getting responses and trying to identify, well, if there's something that doesn't quite match up with observations on the ground, instead of just dismissing it as an anomaly, but exploring why, that is so key. And in this case has really led us to a crucial part of that question. So I think it's incredibly valuable to do these types of engagement where we're looking at data and we're looking at local perceptions and we're comparing them. So I just want to sort of start off with that. I think that's a vital aspect, and without that type of local engagement across the entire river basin, the data is only so useful. It's only useful to those who trust it. It's only useful to those who can find direct applications for it. So this is a good opportunity for those of us who work in that data space to rethink how we're communicating it, and to also try to build new partnerships with actors on the ground who might not have engaged with us previously because they might not have had the chance to understand the data or see why it might not quite match their perceptions. So I think it's incredibly useful for that. I also want to just highlight, I think the sand mining issue is crucial. Obviously, sand mining has been going on across the Mekong River Basin for decades. As most of you probably know, it's driven largely by construction. Sand is a major ingredient for cement and concrete that are absolutely necessary for modern urban infrastructure and for large infrastructure projects across the basin. So when the sand mining is happening, it is often directly feeding other relatively local development projects inside Thailand, inside Laos, inside Cambodia, and inside Vietnam. Sometimes, though, it goes farther afield. And I think that the point that Ian raised about there being uncertainty about exactly what amount of sand is taken out. Ian mentioned, the countries are not reporting it to the Mekong River Commission, so it's very difficult to get a big picture perspective of exactly how much sand is being removed from the system. And I think that's true, but it also highlights a challenge, which is that I don't think all of the countries are accurately measuring exactly how much sand is being taken out of their own borders. We do have licensing permits. Those tend to go on record, but in many cases, they may not be complete, and they may not be sort of ground truth and tracked to confirm that when a license is given to a sand mining company, that they are taking exactly the amount of sand out that they're licensed. And I think a particularly good example of this can be seen from a study that came out a few years back, where in Cambodia, there were reports on the amount of exports of sand to Singapore, and the number that Cambodia was reporting was significantly lower, multitudes lower even, than the amount of sand that Singapore said it was importing from Cambodia. So there simply wasn't enough data in the system being tracked in standardized ways across the entirety of the country to really know how much sand was being taken out. And obviously, Ian has highlighted through some of these local impacts, and Ajahn Kanakon also highlighted from some of her work, how this is impacting livelihoods, how it's impacting subsistence farming. It also has broader impacts for the entirety of the basin, particularly for Vietnam, where a more recent study from WWF has indicated that with current extraction rates that they're seeing, there's not going to be enough sand to maintain the integrity of the delta within the next 2 decades. So it is a quite serious problem at various different levels, ecological, livelihood, economic, and it really does require more coordination to address. And I think this study is exceptionally useful because it does highlight the localized impacts of sand mining and how that integrates with broader changes that are being seen from dam operations and how they affect river flow more broadly. So I'm going to pause there because I do want to make sure we have plenty of time left for the Q&A session, and I see we've got good questions coming in, but those were a couple of the things that really stood out to me from the presentation today.
Thanks, Courtney. Thanks, Ajahn Kanakwan. Ian, quick reactions from you, and then we'll move to these good questions that are coming in.
Well, yeah, thank you for both of Ajahn Kanakwan and Courtney's comments. I think they're great. I think they're important comments, and I think that this integration, especially what Kanakwan talked about, local knowledge and scientific knowledge, merging them and having a more integrated understanding of people's perceptions. I mean, for example, we have certain debates that we're having at the higher levels. But when I was in villages in Ubon, people were telling me that they had gone to villages, they'd gone to meetings, in Nong Khai and places like that. and they'd met other villagers from there, and they had been debating, because the villagers in Nong Khai were saying, oh, there's less water, and the ones in Ubon saying, no, there's definitely more water. And so this is actually a debate that's already been happening amongst villagers. But we were not aware of this debate. So there are different debates happening. We need to understand what those debates are so that we can, address them and deal with them, and we're on the same page. So I think that was, one important thing. I think also the point of Gunokwan about, making this available in different languages is important. I mean, what I've been trying to do so far is I've actually presented this research in 4 different languages and dialects so far. I presented it in Lao, in straight up Lao from Laos. I presented it in Isan dialect from northeastern Thailand. I've presented it in Central Thai, and now I've also presented it in English. So I'm trying to get it out to different groups of people. And when things are written up, maybe there'll be a chance to in a written form. But, I think also a lot of people on the river may not, want to read long documents. It's more important to verbally present it to them, and so I've been trying to do that. And I hope that more of that can happen in the future. And also I've been going back to some of the NGOs that have helped to coordinate this. And, they're also taking this information to villagers themselves, separately. I mean, I don't have to be the one that does this only. It can be other people, even Gunokwan herself, or other people that go down to villages are able to, so this is another, aspect of it all, which I think is important. Just one thing about Courtney's comments, I mean, which I think were great. The one thing to remember, though, is that the sand that's being exported is sea sand. It's not the river sand from the Mekong. So the river sand from the Mekong is not being exported. It's sea sand from along the coast that's going to Singapore for land reclamation purposes. So it's still sand, but it's just a different type of sand. The sand that is from the sea, you can't use it for construction because it's got a lot of salt content. And the river sand you can use for construction. So one set of sand is being used for construction. The other is being used more for land reclamation. But that's another issue. But anyway, I want to give us some time for questions. So I'll leave it at that. I could say more, but thank you both of you for your comments on that. They're very useful.
Good, thanks, Ian. All right, let's jump into these questions, and there are some good ones. First comes from Ian Douglas about the turbidity data. How reliable is that data, and is it based on continuous recording or point samples at various intervals?
So, it's hard to say how exactly accurate it is. I mean, this is Thai government data from the Water Resources Department, and they have been collecting it continuously. They have a large data set. And so we asked them for, 3 years in the early 90s and 3 years in the early 2000s, full data sets. And we asked for the certain places where we thought that would be useful, the higher up levels and the lower levels in the middle, and, they provided that. And, it's hard to say how accurate it is. What we've been understanding is that they collect this data 2 or 3 times a month, depending on the time of year. So in the rainy season, they collect it more often. In the dry season, it's less frequent that they collect the data. But I mean, there may be some, it's possible that there could be some problems with the accuracy, but I don't have any reason to believe that that's the case. I don't have any evidence to say that's the case. Just one other thing to mention, actually, related to Brian's first comments in the opening was, it's one thing that we found that I didn't mention earlier, which is that there's actually a huge number of places along the river where they're actually collecting water data, but only a very small of that amount of data, that data is going to the Mekong River Commission and is publicly available. In Nakhon Phanom and Mukdahan provinces alone, there are at least 30 gauges along the Mekong. Okay? 30 gauges. I mean, we were just going to villages to talk to people, and we find these, places where people have been collecting data since the early 1960s. Sometimes it was a father, and then the father died, and the son took over, or the daughter took over. I mean, this has been going on. So there's a lot more data available, but that data is not shared, with the Mekong River Commission. So that's just something to keep in mind as well. Okay.
That sounds
Next
like
question.
that sounds like a low-hanging fruit for incorporation into the MRC's data collection mechanism.
But it depends if the governments are willing to provide it or not. That's the thing.
Right.
I think we have to understand that only, this turbidity data as well is not data
Yeah,
that's being provided. We
it's
had to ask.
sensitive. Yeah, it can be sensitive. It leads to findings that could be inconvenient for some actors. So now speaking of actors, Stu Mata has a question about how Thai actors or officials explain the need for river embankments. Do they draw causality on the upstream dam impacts as a need to build more embankments, or are there other rationale for it?
Let me answer that question in two parts, because one of the things that came up earlier that Ajahn Gunokwan mentioned was, that some of the villagers may understand this is due to the dam, and some of them may not be as clear. But in our findings, we went to some villages that were connected to networks of people and some that were not connected at all. And we didn't find any villages where the people didn't know it was due to the dams. Every single village that we went to is aware that this is due to the dams. This is widely understood amongst local people. Okay, coming back to the question. So what was the question again?
I think it's also about Thai actors, decision makers that
okay.
are investing in the embankments.
So we didn't specifically, we haven't specifically talked to higher level government officials about their reasoning for why they're putting embankments in. But we did talk to local government officials and a lot of local people about this. And their explanation was that there had been a lot of erosion. And they did equate that largely to the dams, that they noticed an increased amount of erosion after the dams were being built, and that they needed to have some way to solve this problem. And even though they recognized that the embankments are causing impacts in and of themselves, they felt that this was necessary. So I guess that the government people also understand it that way, because it was pretty consistent across villages that people understood that the reason for them was due to this. So everyone seemed to think it was due to erosion.
Yeah, well, I think that it's kind of easier to pin the causality of riverbank erosion on upstream dams and sediment removal than it is, say, on fisheries depletion and other impacts. I mean, we've made a direct through line to costs related to upstream damming, and as a result of damming in Laos and in China. So following on with the embankment question, what about the ecological impacts? This comes from Andy Stone. Is there another set of impacts that comes with embankments? Do they help the situation at all?
Can I say something, Ian?
Sure.
Can I add to you?
Please.
Because I just came back from the Mekong River Basin, where the provincial local authority in Ubon and in many provinces, also they have a plan to build embankment along the major river in order to stop riverbank erosion, as Ian said. But the impacts quite severe, particularly people who use the river. They found that the riverbank, the embankment destroy the ecological system. They could be able to farm anything along the riverbank as ever, and also for women. They use the riverbank women use the riverbank, like they use scoop, they use like simple fishing tool to get small shrimp or small fish along the riverbank. And also some people raise cattle along the riverbank so hard. It's not quite easy for cattle to place around the riverbank garden. So not just ecological impacts, and also socio-economic impacts as well, felt by and told by villagers along the Mekong River Basin and also in Ubon Ratchathani too. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Let me explain a little bit more on this question. I didn't go into all the details because of limited time.
Sure.
But there are lots of like a lot of native plant species have disappeared. Impact on riverbank gardening, and it's interesting in some cases where they built these embankments for like 15 or more years, because this is how long the impacts have been happening, or even 20 years. at first, after they built them new, they can't use it all for riverbank gardening. It disappears entirely. But in some cases, after many years, the sediment has accumulated on top of the riverbank, and then they can do some riverbank gardening again. The problem is now is that they're noticing that in the rainy season, the water's not coming up as high, so the sediment's not being deposited as much, and there's not as much sediment to deposit. So it's taking longer for that process to occur compared to used to. But in terms of the native plants returning and stuff, that's not really, so there's a lot of associated issues. And we got into a lot of details about, certain types of insects, and, we talked about crabs and shrimp and fish and all kinds of things. I could, it's too much to get into now, but there are, a lot of important ecological impacts that are coming from the riverbank embankments. And, this is directly attributable. This is an impact of the dams. And I think it hasn't been thought of that way in the past, but it really should be. And so there are very significant impacts. And I was surprised to see so much of the river, even in rather remote areas where they've been fully embanked. And in some cases, it's even more than one embankment. They built an embankment, and there's a little sandbar that develops in front of it. Then they build another embankment. I mean, there's in front of Nakhon Phanom, there's been 3 embankments built so far. So this is happening. Embankments has become a huge, factor. And I could go into a lot about that, but again, we're running out of time, so I don't want to. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, that's probably another topic for another Mekong Water Data Hour, and a needed study as well. So I encourage you to do that, Ian. We should wrap up with a final question, and that comes from Peter John Maynell about adaptation. And he asks, how can we help the river adapt to the situation? Do we have to accept this changed sediment flow situation in the Mekong as a new normal?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it was fun. It was strange because when I was talking to one of the sand mining operators north of Vientiane, he had told me that he had actually gone to Europe, and he had heard there that people were actually, the governments there were actually creating sand and pouring it into the river to try to get some sediment back into the river as a mitigation measure. Now, I'm not saying that's about to happen in the case of the Mekong, but he actually predicted, he said, I don't think that we're going to be taking sand out of the river forever, because actually the sand that comes to the Mekong River, according to him, is not the best quality sand for construction. And the stones that are taken from the river also are rounded, which are not the best for construction. The grain of sand size in the Mekong is quite small. And the best for construction is actually a little bit larger size, which they actually get from the tributaries more than from the Mekong. So there's a lot of aspects related to this. And, I mean, in terms of mitigation, obviously one thing that could be done is that water could be, people have to realize that collecting water in the rainy season and releasing in the dry season is an environmental impact. If there was more effort to kind of replicate the original flows by not releasing as much water in the dry season, as is being the case this year, for example, that would be a benefit for the water. Now, in terms of the sediment, there are some cases like the Sayabuli Dam, which they have built a system in there for opening up and releasing some of the sediment that gets trapped in behind there. But of course, it's not released in the same rate that it was historically, and at the same times either. And especially so this is it helps somewhat, but it's not going to solve all the problems. And I think that we have to recognize that already a lot of the sediment is behind dams now, and but it could get a lot worse. I mean, the water level situation could get worse. The sediment situation could get more. The more dams, this is a cumulative impact of a lot of different projects, and so we have to understand that the more dams that are built, even ones that we might think are not causing that much impacts, could be causing a lot more cumulative impacts over time that we're not aware of. So this needs to be there needs to be more awareness about this, and people need to start thinking about mitigation. So it's great that you bring up this question. I don't have all the answers because we've just found out about this relatively recently, but I do think that this is something that people need to think more about, and how to adapt and how to deal with this issue. I mean, like I said, in Europe and some of the rivers there, they're literally creating sand and throwing it into the river to try to mitigate. And meanwhile, in Thailand alone, there's 141 sand concessions, sending sand all over, Thailand for construction purposes, and in Laos as well. And apparently the machinery is getting more sophisticated, so they can, larger machines, they can take more sand out than they used to be able to. And so this is something that needs to have more consideration. And we need to understand more about the relative impact of sand mining compared to dam holding back sediment. We think that the dams holding back sediment is the main impact. That maybe it's not as much as sand mining, because the big changes seem to have occurred when dams were built, not when, not gradually over time, So, but again, more needs to be done on this, and there needs to be more research, and we need to understand more about so that we can affect policy. Like if sand mining is a relatively small impact, let's say, I'm not saying it is, I'm just saying it could be, then maybe less emphasis on that needs to be put on, and more on releasing sand from behind dams. If, on the other hand, sand mining is a greater impact than what we understand, but there's no data, to say, and the data is not accurate, as Courtney mentioned earlier, that would also affect the type of policy decisions that need to be made. So I think we need to understand more about what's happening so that we can, recommend and advocate for the right, important policy changes.
Well, Ian, thank you so much for bringing so many of these new findings to the fore and opening up, new channels of research and policy exploration and planning exploration that needs to be done, just like you've done so many times over the last decades with your work on the Mekong. It's really a tremendous effort, and I encourage you to keep, pushing, keep revealing and thinking through possible new lines of exploration and response. And we look forward to the published work that is to come. So again, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Ian Baird, Ganakwan Manaram, both of you calling in from Thailand late at night, Courtney from the Stimson Center. This is another episode or installation of the Mekong Water Data Hour. If you tuning in, have interesting research coming out, either getting ready to publish or already published, we'd be happy to feature it here at the Mekong Water Data Hour from the Stimson Center. And I would be remiss to not say that this Mekong Water Data Hour is supported by the U.S. Department of State's Mekong Water Data Initiative through the Mekong Dam Monitor Project. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Thank you for your efforts, Ian. Good night. Thank you.